Uh, Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is the first panel that we are having virtually for this year's conference in 2021, the PCC's Forging the Cooperative Digital Economy, hashtag the new common sense. This panel is going to look at mapping the landscape and the challenges and the opportunities that exist for putting together a different form of ownership on the digital economy. So looking at what the current status and what are the potential that exists for the cooperative digital landscape in India. So, and there are a few questions that we're addressing, as you would have already read if you have come this far. It's if there is something very distinct about India. I mean, India itself is a very broad region, but nevertheless, if there is something distinct about India that is not that applicable in other places, and how can we go about thinking about it, framing it, and so on? And what can we learn about the growth of platform cooperatives and other community owned and community sharing platforms that exist elsewhere and within India? How can we develop them? Who are the actors that exist? What challenges that they face? Um, and also with this increasing platformization process that has happened over the past few years and is accelerating even more currently, um, how can this be used to bridge the digital divide that has become so prominent and disrupted most people's lives in the country? And what is gained and at whose expense in this platformization process, and who benefits from it? And how can those things be done differently from where we are now? So we are focused on what is the situation right now, but also driven towards how we can get it done differently. And we have an excellent panel here, whom I'm just going to briefly introduce, and then we'll have to hear from their presentations, and then we have a short period of time for question answers. So please feel free to put in your questions in the chat, your comments. We will gather them and put it in a document and send it out to everyone who's attended. So we are going to start with Vibodh Parthasarathi, who is a professor at the Center for Culture, Media and Governance at Jamia Millia Islamia, and a visiting fellow at the Center for Media, Data and Society at the Central European University. He has been a visiting scholar and a very prolific scholar at many places, and is associated in editorial advisory roles in leading scientific journals and in book series at MIT Press and Oxford University Press, and is also the associate editor for the journal Digital Media and Policy. And most importantly, most relevant for this panel, he co-edited a book that released a couple of years ago called Platform Capitalism in India, which is very central to the questions we're going to address today. And I'll let Vibodh take it away, and I'll give brief introductions for everyone else as we move on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity, Aman, to share the stage with some really experienced co-panelists here. As I'm the first to go, I would sort of like to chalk out some perspectives on the big picture when you're talking about platforms and platform cooperatives. Let me sort of begin by capturing what I see as the core aspects of platformization, including the gains and the risks which you just sort of talked about here. I think for me, the first thing is that platforms institutionalize new forms of market systems. They don't really produce new commodities. What they do is that they aggregate publics and existing markets to derive value out of what I call interdependent markets. So it's a kind of new formulation of pre-existing market systems. The pandemic actually brought into the open who gains and who loses from platforms. So, for instance, the terms and conditions in which individuals work for platforms, that's something which came out very clearly. From the side of business, we also see during and just after the pandemic, high stock valuations of platforms. And this sort of typifies financial dynamics in neoliberal markets, where investors tend to reward the strategy of companies who accumulated users rather than have increased profits. In platforms all around us, we see a kind of a reiteration of challenges of traditional industrial monopolies. So they reveal problems of monopoly over the knowledge about what is known about platform users and audiences, which of course has led to arguments about the platform business actually being a business of metrics. And it's not therefore just the monopoly over platforms, but also monopoly over the metrics, which tells us and others in the ecology about how different platforms are doing here. And this is something I've written about recently, and I'm quite curious to sort of understand these two different levels of monopolies which have been risked by the advent of platforms, as in the industrial monopoly and the monopoly over the knowledge created by these entities. And the last sort of big picture here is what we also see is the phenomena of what I call the platformization of the state. So, of course, that also includes the privatization of what were once badly or not so well managed public utilities and infrastructure. And I'll touch upon some of these aspects later on. So I think in light of these platform risks, I feel we could sort of try and look at platform cooperativism as a compulsion, as one of the possible responses to the emerging monopoly capitalism developing on platforms. So with the concentration of wealth, information, and power, I do see the idea of cooperatism on platforms to become appealing, at least to some folks. Let me just plug this, the book which Aman referred to and which has sort of captured some of these wider arguments about platform risks. The question, of course, is what opportunities and constraints does the sort of broad cooperative sectors present for platform cooperativism? And I think for me, discussions on platform co-ops provides an opportunity to reflect upon three core but very perennial challenges. One, of course, is that of owners and ownership of platforms. And this opens out to debates on accountability and participation. The second challenge is about decision-making processes in large organizations. And this again opens out to debates on pluralism, on openness, and on transparency. I mean, for me, I find discussions on stakeholders in the digital economy generally tend to sideline the fact that all stakeholders don't have the same stakes. And therefore, sort of discussions of stakeholders tend to flat out different creases among those who are involved and implicated by decision-making processes. And the third perennial challenge, which comes up by discussions on platform cooperativism, is about the risks of stateness. And this would, I think, pretty clearly connect with wider debates on the deepening of democracy. So these three big challenges: ownership, decision-making, and the potential of deepening of democracy, for me, converge on discussions on platform co-ops. There are two sides, I feel, for discussion on platform co-ops. One, of course, is the engagement of existing cooperatives with the platform economy. So this sort of involves the processes of cooperatives, pre-existing cooperatives, in their own efforts at platformization. This may, of course, include their various partnerships and collaborations with big platforms. So, for example, if you have a large milk cooperative in India, and they are vending their products through the large e-commerce sites. Yeah. What happens to the cooperative sensibility there? Yeah. And I'm keen to hear what Saloni and Sonia's experiences are on this idea of pre-existing cooperatives embracing the digital economy. Yeah. The second side is, of course, discussions on native digital cooperatives there. Okay, so that's discussions about cooperative efforts in the digital economy. Yeah. Now, on both sides, we can think of platform co-ops potentially benefiting communities that are defined by geography, social communities, and of course, different types of epistemic communities. Yeah. But what I've been wondering is the extent to which such initiatives, both of traditional cooperatives embracing digital platforms and native digital cooperatives, to what extent have the initiatives of offering digital products and services managed to retain their cooperative sensibilities? Yeah. And to get a sense of this, I would sort of list three parameters to evaluate this. Yeah. One, of course, going back to the key issue of the imagination of ownership. So what's the imagination of ownership, organization on platform cooperatives? Yeah. The second are matters of technology and design. Yeah. Okay. So do we see a kind of a cooperative sensibility infused in the tech and design choices in platform cooperatives? Yeah. And perhaps Arun might talk more about this, so I'll keep it here for now. Yeah. And the third parameter I would use to evaluate the retaining of this cooperative sensibility on platforms is the legal framework that they sort of choose to involve themselves in there. So here I'm talking about things like terms of service, privacy norms, and data practices. Yeah. Okay. I mean, Anita might touch upon this, but for me, if we look at native digital cooperatives from such parameters, then how are they really different from that of existing big platforms? Yeah. So be it in the domain of fintech, health, employment, and of course, education. Yeah. I mean, how is this kind of legal imagination translated in the efforts of platform cooperativism is something I'm curious to think about a bit more. Yeah. There is a lot of philanthropic support, both from industrial and financial capital, that's going into developing native digital cooperative platforms. Yeah. Okay. But there again, while their content and practice may be critical of big platforms and perhaps even more widely of neoliberalism, but these sort of alternative or quote unquote independent platforms are not often legally structured as cooperatives. Yeah. And this then I see gets reflected in their websites along the three parameters which I just talked about earlier. Yeah. I think at this point of time, there is something to say about the learnings from the inheritance of cooperatives and the cooperative movement in India. I think the first thing which is striking for me is in thinking about platform co-ops is that concerns which were voiced in debates on alternative media over 20 years ago are kind of resurfacing. Okay. I think that debate was quite intense on alternative media, but somehow didn't lead to any sort of concrete propositions, at least in the South Asian context here. So what's the salience of those debates? What benefits? How can we benefit by recovering some aspects of those debates on the alternative voiced a couple of days ago? Yeah. The other thing which comes to mind when I think about the inheritance of cooperative movements in India is that there seems to be a distinction. On the one hand, uh, cooperatives tend to function in product markets. Essentially, cooperatives are trying to propose a different imagination of supply chains of products, okay, as opposed to unions, which functioned in labor markets, raising issues of bargaining, safety, long-term well-being, and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering, therefore, whether discussions on platform co-ops offer an opportunity to bridge these two legacy divides. Okay, some efforts I think could be seen in initiatives on the platformization of work, which is taking place in India. And here again, perhaps I can share some relevant links here. There are, of course, impediments in the growth of what I call the cooperative sensibility and cooperative practice. And some of these, of course, stem from the regulatory framework in India that have tended to prevent more inclusive and participatory forms of ownership and decision making in the information economy. So quite clearly, of course, there are financial and legal barriers to market entry that determine what kind of actors could take part in the digital economy, especially in cases where licensing is required. And here, for example, I would like to sort of take us back nearly 20 years with the beginnings of news broadcasting in India, when news was demonopolized and there was private news broadcasting. And one of the parameters there for private news broadcasters was that unions were ineligible to apply for a license. Okay, and I think if we look at the fine print of eligibility criteria for many digital services, we might see a bias towards large for-profit companies. And this clearly, of course, is an entry barrier. Pandemic and platforms, just a couple of points on that. I think for me, the pandemic gave legitimacies to certain forms of platform work, especially a model of consumption through platform delivery. And it would be good to know what the experiences of cooperatives who are using these delivery services, how did that unfold during the pandemic? The pandemic also enhanced the role of platforms as providers of core infrastructure and even civic functions. Okay, so that's something where, again, the pandemic has boosted the position of certain players in the platform economy. And of course, the pandemic also illustrated the role of the government as users of platforms in different ways. So I think, in a nutshell, the pandemic seems to have augmented those who are in position of power and economic dominance in the platform economy much more than what it was before. Just to end up, perhaps in a more optimistic note, I'm wondering whether there is something to be drawn on in the principles underlying the ideas of commons, and whether there's something there to learn from when we are imagining platform cooperatives. Okay, and of course here I'm invoking Ostrom's half a dozen pointers on commons. And there again, issues of participatory decision making are pretty much central to this imagination. And there are, of course, cooperatives in India, SEWA being one of them, where this is very much ingrained in the organization practice. There is also something to be thought in terms of the network effect of cooperatives. So the way in which network effects have a strong role to play in commons, that is something perhaps which needs to be leveraged much more when we talk about cooperatives. The experience of cooperative banks, in a sense, in this case, could be highlighted, which of course, of the last 30 years have been kind of diluted or maimed over the years, but there is something there which one can sort of talk about here. I think one of the aspects which also emerges from the principles of commons is the issue of cooperatives seeking legitimacy from formal power structures here. Okay, and again here the example of Amul, the large milk cooperative, is quite telling here, because of it becoming an extension of a state initiative, while of course maintaining their independence. Couple of other points on the sort of downside is when we are talking about the digital economy as a whole, there's a lot of discussion on aspects of oversight. Okay, so the way in which, of course, oversight mechanisms have been developed for different kinds of commons, whether there's something there that could be infused when we are talking about monitoring and oversight of the behavior of platform co-ops. Can, for example, monitoring be more participatory in platform co-ops? Because then that would be one way in which platform co-ops distinguish themselves from sort of the big platforms. Also, in terms of scenarios where there is abuse of platforms. Okay. And there, of course, typically with big platforms and governments, the response has been in terms of fines. And therefore, again, pecuniary values are evoked there. But can we imagine non-pecuniary values, such as, say, loss in reputation, being one way in which sanctions could be introduced in the platform economy? So I'll just finish here to sort of provide the sort of big picture, and then I will be happy to sort of talk to my co-panelists, and then of course look at sort of discussions from the floor as well. Thanks very much, Aman.
Thank you so much, Vibodh. That was very fascinating. And I have a lot of questions, I'm sure most people do, but we have to move on. And our next speaker is going to be Arun M., who's the program head for the International Center for Free and Open Source Software, based out of Trivandrum, in Kerala. And he has been quite a major free software advocate and founder of institutions around it, which has had an impact in migrations of schools to government institutions towards free software. He has a background in science, engineering, and applied economics, and his work is focused in innovation and technological change. And he's been working with cooperatives and unions and government institutions towards more of a commons-based approach from the tech side. I'm very excited to hear about what Arun has to say. You can take the floor, Arun.
Thanks, Aman. Am I audible?
If you could increase your volume for the mic.
Yeah, is it better now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Aman. I'm trying to bring some insight we got from some informal research we undertook around platform initiatives that came up in Kerala. So most of them were failures, but what can we learn from them? So that's what I'm trying to look at in this 10 minutes. Maybe I should start from what platform cooperativism means to me, because it can mean many things, I feel. For me, platform cooperativism is about building an alternative to the existing dominant form of platforms. because we are seeing how the platforms are exploiting the labor and making the producer as well as users very weak in the power relation. So can we build an alternative to this dominant forms of platforms inspired by the cooperative movements, and how we can bring that to the digital domain? So this is the perspective in which we were trying to look at the platform cooperatives. So, so I want to speculate from the studies we did on what are the major stumbling blocks in building alternatives to the platform and leveraging the cooperative model in the context of India. So let us start with the cooperativism. One interesting aspect of cooperativism in India, which we need to take note of, is it is largely state driven. So a benevolent state was helping to establish these cooperatives, and the cooperatives were kind of helping the larger society and the members in particular in terms of becoming better in production and gaining more value in their production. So whether we consider Amul or the cooperatives in Kerala, they are more or less the same. It's sponsored by the state. And it was under a socialistic political perspective, which is dominant at that point of time, that was driving this kind of successful cooperatives from emerging in India. And then they also brought in fantastic professionals into this cooperative space. And I would say many of the successful initiatives had key entrepreneurs and who valued the social benefits over the private benefit that they could have derived from their professional capabilities. So even they were driving, they were largely motivated and driven by a dominant political perspective, which was around the socialistic value systems. So, so this patronage of the state we cannot ignore in the context of cooperatives in India. And probably that is one of the major stumbling blocks, which is quite different from the cooperativism which we see in other parts of the world. But for example, I was looking at the technology cooperatives in the Europe, which are not really benefiting directly from the state patronage, or that is not their primary drive. There is a politics which is quite often in conflict with the state. And probably, I don't know much about the history, but again, I assume that largely the cooperatives were in the European countries, they were independent of the state, building an alternative to the dominant businesses and the state. So this history and also the legal framework which still exists makes the Indian cooperatives largely an extension of the state welfare mechanism. It is the same in almost all the parts of the country. So, when the state takes a a position which is not favorable to the cooperatives, how will they survive and what is their response? That is one challenge I feel. The second aspect, so when the state doesn't have that kind of confidence it once used to have, the cooperatives are not able to execute as much as they wanted. But I'm seeing this in the cooperative initiatives that has come up in the digital domain in the recent past. Another aspect is the technology and the platform. The platform, which is largely driven by the ICT technologies, it has significant scale advantages, and it requires expertise, specialized expertise, and very deep technological capabilities as well as capital. So, and here we find that we don't have that much interested entrepreneurs as we had in the early parts of Indian independence. After we don't have the people who sufficient number of entrepreneurs who are willing to take a different view. And even if they take a different view, the capital which is available to them to build an alternate platform is questionable. And a lot of cooperatives which are trying to build the platform, they underestimate the technological intensity of building these platforms. And they fail, because it is this technology and the power of the technology that is driving the success of the platforms. So we cannot ignore that part. And unfortunately, we are not seeing the cooperativism developing in the ICT segment and the technology segment in India. I could see some initiatives in other parts of the world, particularly some of the European initiatives are very, very interesting, but not in the case of India. So essentially, without a political environment which is on the one hand giving a legitimacy to the cooperativism and the technological capabilities and the capital that can build this alternate platform, I think it is very, very difficult for cooperatives to build platform or platforms to emerge as cooperatives. That is what our experience tells us. So this means essentially we have to fight for a political change. The state had done a pretty good job in the past, and it can do a lot in the future. And how should state intervene? That's the other question. Maybe not as the kind of patronage it was providing in the past, but they can use the new leverages like the monopoly related legislations as well as the commons, because the platform's power ultimately depends on the information base they create out of the participants, which is essentially pooled from the participants, which should be part of the commons in some way. So can we consider these aspects and bring new legislations that will kind of put control over these platforms and enable other actors to emerge? So one good example is the payment systems. It is not really about platform in the traditional sense of the Uber or Amazon e-com portal, but the Indian government's work on the payment system enabled a level playing ground for many enterprises to emerge and operate. So I think it is only by new state legislative interventions we can have a hope for, which is around monopoly, privacy, and those legislation can be built a cooperative platform, and a larger political discourse must happen. And inertia is also, for example, now we are having this session on proprietary platforms, whereas it's how can we build networks of cooperatives providing video hosting and video conferencing systems. We have the technologies there, but why is not cooperatives emerging in this segment? There is a lot of issues here. I'm not going into the details, but I just want to reiterate the Indian situation, which is quite unique in terms of its legacy of the cooperativism in India, as well as the role the technology plays in the platforms. These two aspects need special consideration if we need to build platform cooperatives in India. That is what we kind of infer from our initial results of the experience we had in Kerala around platforms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arun.
Thank you so much, Arun.
That was great. Our next speaker is Sonia George, who is the General Secretary of the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA Kerala, based out of Trivandrum. And she has been associated with SEWA for the last 20 years, with her main role being organizing informal women workers for their rights and recognition. She has been a part of state, national, and international policy and legislative discussions. Yeah, I would let her take the floor. Sonia?
Yes. Thank you, Aman, and thank you for this opportunity to speak in this webinar. I have been hearing both Arun and Professor Vibodh on different aspects of platform cooperatives and maybe in the era of a capitalist society means how could we react or respond to such initiatives. And maybe I'm also speaking from my experience of working in an organization like SEWA for the past 20 years, on maybe completely from an informal economy perspective, where we engage with workers, women workers in the informal economy of India, basically. And as it was mentioned by Professor Vibodh, we have been working for many years as a confluence of labor, cooperative, and women's movement in the country. That is the identity of SEWA that we are talking about. So on the basis of that, means there were many experiences of bringing workers together in the context of rights. That was one of our first approach, rather than welfare, how could we move towards a right-based approach in terms of work and in terms of bringing together or collectivizing people. So these were the two main approaches in the process. And now we talk about platform, in the sense platform cooperatives. When we talk about the pros and cons, it was explained well by both the two previous speakers. In their own context, it was well explained. Maybe my first contextual reflection is means we are speaking, basically I'm speaking from the context of informality, and cooperative movement was one step towards collectivizing people who are so scattered in terms of work, in terms of skills, and in terms of bringing together their skills and livelihoods together. So that was one of the contexts where the history of cooperative movement and also SEWA movement in the country also explains how we have gone forward. And maybe as we go to the second stage, the pandemic has exposed different possibilities in the new normal context to legitimize situations of poverty, situations of informality, and situations of collectivization in a different lens, to look at it in a different lens. Means, for example, the first things that comes into my mind is that if, for example, it was referred about Arun has well pointed out, how could platform cooperative be emerged as an alternative to the existing platforms? So that means existing platforms have a story of, or an experience of exploitation, or a story of divisiveness to share with us. So I think the first experience of that should go from that story of divisiveness that we would like to address. But how do we address is the big question for a country like India. Means, for example, digital divide. We talk about technology, we talk about access to technology, especially in the new context. It was basically our children in terms of education, means have been struggling to access the technology for the education. That was the same experience in the urban and rural divide, maybe in the context of India. Digital access is one of the important constraints that we find in terms of emerging towards new alternatives. Who can afford this geographical discrepancies? That is very important in the context. Maybe means I'm a tribal, or I'm a Dalit, or I'm a woman, or a fisher community representative. Maybe my access to the systems that we are talking about will be completely different from what the mainstream world talks about. So that is one of the first things that I would like to put forward, means digital access, and how could it be understood in the context of this existing divisions or marginalizations in the society. That is very important that we have to. So how could platform cooperative could address this issue is very important in the context. Another main thing is the gender divide that we talk about. Let's look at the existing models of cooperatives that is being started in the process. Now there have been new forms of cooperatives that, in the names of startups, sometimes startups and cooperatives are mixed in the process. That means most of the things that we look at, most of the initiatives that have started in the context of accessing technology, that have been so much, the experiments are so much of male-dominated experiences, in terms of accessing technology, in terms of accessing new forms of entrepreneurial activities, or new forms of evolving into the labor market process. So that is something that we have to think about. How do we address the gender divide in the process, and gender and the intersectionalities of these processes? That how do we consider when the platform economy or the platform cooperatives that many are talking about? How could those intersectionalities be possible at different levels, in terms of geography, in terms of marginalization? Means how could those intersectionalities work towards a more egalitarian or equitable approach to platform economy? That is something that was very important. SEWA's experiment was always with small collectivization. Means it's like small cooperatives coming together with women's own share, putting together into into a particular livelihood approach, and bringing the different aspects of that approach together, so that means women, all the women who are involved in that particular process have equal access to means what they were sharing and what they were into the dominant world. So that equal access is a big question that we have to address. How could this equal access is possible? We have, I think Professor Vibodh has also shared about this new cooperative ministry in the country that has been launched recently. And I think the entire new approach is, rather than moving towards access to commons or access to resources and livelihood, it's moving towards a thrift and credit path. So that is one of the experiences, collectivization or bringing together people towards making them liable to either the nationalized banks or private banks or part of microfinance agencies. That is basically all small cooperatives turn into huge debts through the microfinance process that is happening. So this thrift and credit process and through the microfinancing process merged into the cooperativization has made, has marginalized or has made the people push towards the periphery so that they lost the game in the process. That is what we have experienced in the process. So how could small cooperatives be visualized in the process towards a more equitable, service-oriented accessibility? That is something that we have to think in its terms. I was talking about the gender divisions. For example, in terms of the liabilities, in terms of wages, how do we calculate? So mostly, as Arun has also pointed out, this welfareism is more promoted towards cooperativization in the process, in the capitalist process. So how could platform economy could emerge as a system to alter this process of welfareism to rights? That is something that we have to talk about. That is how we should bring the people into the process, questioning the issues of marginalization, and questioning the issues of access, and questioning the issues of equitability in the process of bringing people towards equal rights. So I think that is very important in the process of recognizing. Here again, the role of the state comes. For example, India has this new cooperative ministry. India, different states have different cooperative laws, and platform is emerging as we have these experiences of maybe taxis or food, means transport of food, and it has a very individualistic oriented kind of platform experiences or platform visibility in the process. So how could we bring together the process? Is there any possibility of unionizing the workers? No, again, it was discussed. No, how could unions and cooperatives could come together in the platform economy? That is very important, because this entire question of employed, self-employed, without the presence of an employer or the invisible presence of an employer towards an entrepreneur, that is the new capital-oriented tendency that is emerging. So how could platform cooperative raise these issues? Means, is there any role for a workers' organization in the process? Whether workers' organizations or civil society organizations can bring together these issues in the process of what you call legitimizing this exercise of scattering people, and also towards means we are ILO recommendation 204 clearly says that means we have to shift, we have to transform, or there should be a transition from the informal to formal. So platform was used as one of the kind of formalization process that, and also cooperatives is another form of formalization process. So how could this bring together this formalization in the context of increasing informality? How are we going to think about that? Is that possible in the process of a platform platform cooperative? That is something that we have to repeatedly ask in the process. Are there any means? One of the criteria for becoming formal is we have to be a taxpayer or taxpayer. That is one of the criteria of formality, or we have to have access to this platform. So there again, the questions of this digital divide and the gender divide, and also the caste or race divide comes. No, how could this be possible for people to address this inequality so that there could be a model that emerges in terms of collectivizing the rights, in terms of, especially for example, access to commons. Nowadays, we have been talking a lot of issues of commons, directly or indirectly, means community resources. How could people have access to community resources? Is it possible to address the issues of community resources, land, holding of land, access to land in the process of cooperatives in a platform? Is that means something, what you call physical resources have some kind of meaning in the process? Because means a product is being produced in a particular space. So the question of space is important. That means the question of maybe physical space, the production area. That means if it is an industry or small area, the production process is very important. So does that production process and the space and means the speciality and temporality of that process has any meaning in the process of platform cooperativizing? So that is very important, and that link has to be brought. Otherwise, it's very scattered and people have no access. Means, for example, in India, we work with a lot of urbanization that is happening. Migrant workers are very common in the Indian scenario. People migrate to work in other areas in source of livelihood, and space is an important issue in those processes. And many of the cooperatives or platforms, means many of the people, for example, there's Uber drivers, they are migrant workers. Means the space and temporal issues are very serious in the process for a country like India. So how could we address the physical and the spatial relations, interrelations, intertwining in the process of platform cooperativizing? So I think these are some of the issues that I would like to pose before this audience in order to take forward in the context of India to be discussed more deeply, so that if such processes we are forming as an alternative to the existing platform economy that we see around our world, more discussions, more dialogues, more serious interventions, or more clarity should be there in order to be more inclusive, and that intersectionality should apply in that process at each steps. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sonia. That was really great. Now, next up, we have Anita Gurumuthy, who's the Executive Director for IT for Change and is also a founding member of IT for Change. She serves on various bodies like the UN Secretary General's Group on Technology Facilitation Mechanism, the Paris Peace Forum's Working Group on Algorithm Governance, Save the Children's ICT 4D Brain Trust, and Mindaroo Tech and Policy Labs Board. Without taking too much time, I would want Anita to go forward.
Thank you very much. I know that we are towards the end of the session. I won't take too long. I will build on what my colleagues have spoken already. I guess when tech gets into the mixture, there's always a need to look at the cart and horse problem, right? So here we are deliberating about platform co-ops. So we have to ask ourselves what we want. Do we want cooperative platforms with an emphasis on the ethos of cooperatives? Or if we want the benefits of platformization to be harvested for cooperatives, which is like putting the tech horse ahead. So of course, it's a bit of both, and it's a hard question because digitality changes the way we do things, and our agentic abilities cannot easily be separated into tech and non-tech buckets, right? So the way businesses operate, in which part of their transactions are digital and which part not? That's a very difficult question. Increasingly, as manufacturing is also getting linked to the Internet of Things, etc. So cooperatives in the global south attempting to embrace the practice of platform cooperativism have to deal with the difficult question of how to remain competitive in a mainstream economy, which is what all the colleagues who came before me actually underlined. As such, I think the endeavor of staying together within an economic environment that presents significant adversities is extremely hard. And there is, of course, the lack of agility compared to well-funded competitors when it comes to responding to the vagaries of the market. Of course, there is also the strain consistently on democratic ownership, governance, decision-making, the rules, etc. And when technology gets into the mix, especially in price-sensitive markets, what an Amazon or a Flipkart can do as an e-commerce business, your cooperative may really not be able to do. So this sustainability and scalability comes as a very, very important problem that is ever present. But I think there are some lessons to take away and some dreams to dream, and it's really possible. And I think that there's always room for experiments when our goal is for a million flowers to bloom, so to speak. As with the history of grassroots organizing in India for economic empowerment, what we see in the efforts to collectivize cooperatives is the vital role, I think, for the steward or the catalyst who can bring communities together to gradually build the bonding and bridging capital needed to go platform. And this is not really about an individual. So these are about social intermediaries, worker organizations, and this orchestration is extremely important, and it's different from centralization. Centralization is what Amazon does as a corporation to disempower the edges. But the role of the orchestrator is conversely the institutional mechanism that enables the social coordination of economic production, much like the federation of the SHGs, the self-help groups in India, or cooperatives, which ensures that the collective is able to navigate its economic pursuit without losing sight of its original vision. One of our collaborating partners, Vibodh, who runs a farm-to-table, farm-to-fork service, often remarks that the pandemic and its impact was able to be managed because of the painstaking effort to build this social infrastructure needed to keep this collaboration alive, not only in a reorganized marketplace, but also to navigate the non-market logistics that keeps the community able to stay regenerative with connections to banks, social protection schemes, navigating online portals for access to entitlements. I mean, migrant workers, for instance, may not really have the felicity to type in, but you really need to apply for these schemes with your digital ID in order to get that little bit of money that can see you through. So there's a lot that needs to go on in the background for a marketplace to actually show up online. And this, I think, is extremely important, and this orchestration is really important. This, of course, there's a long history in India's self-help group movement, which shows that this kind of centralized orchestration, which distributes benefits and brings value to the collective, has really been very, very vital. And if I dare say, can also be seen as a very indigenized model from India. The predatory ways by which empowerment is appropriated by capital is a cautionary tale that everybody has spoken about here. And this, I think, is vital to remember if we want to harness the network advantage very differently. So a couple of years ago, Amazon came up with a Saheli program, and Saloni is not here to talk about it, so I could. SEWA Gujarat registered online, and they really wanted to take advantage of it for their health cooperative. But products listed on this kind of pinkwashing scheme of Amazon to onboard women-run businesses, these products would not come up in the open search. So if you actually went to Amazon and searched for products by SEWA, it would not show up. So the big disadvantage was that you needed to pay something as a premium charge for showcasing products online. So in that sense, the algorithmic opacity of Amazon and the marketplace, which is unaccountable, really does not serve the space that Sonia just spoke about, in terms of that speciality of mainstream platforms which try to make place for alternative businesses, that speciality is simply not going to further the ethos of cooperativism. What we actually saw in a research that we undertook with the ILO, and the report is available, it's called Platform Labor in Search of Value, and I can plug that in later, is that there are three models. And the first model is cooperatives emulating mainstream platforms. So the All China Federation of Supply and Marketing Cooperatives in 2018 launched a particular service, which is called the China E-Coop. And this is, as of then, there were 140,000 registered shop owners online with a zillion products being sold. And it uses consumer and supplier profiling pretty much like Amazon does, with big data analytics for its business development strategies. So here is a network which is building on the data practices of the mainstream. We also saw very radical alternatives, platform cooperatives outside the mainstream economy model, particularly from Europe, deploying a data minimalism. So you can build a network data model, which is a platform architecture in which data is not collected for analytics, but just to aid transactions. So somebody will come on a cycle, deliver you your pizza, and go away and destroy your data. Now, this may not necessarily be importable in India, because in the developing South, there's always the question of productive regeneration and sustainable livelihoods. You're looking at a very price-sensitive market. You're not looking at responsible consumerism on a scale that will make your business sustain. So there is, as such, the first barrier to cooperatives, which is to build a customer base and a network base. So the second problem that arises in this day and age is the whole question of data. What I think is very important in a conceptual sense and a policy sense, which is a question that all of us in this panel have tried to grapple with, is what do we need in Indian context in terms of a data policy framework? What we need, as my organization argues, is a data collectivist approach, not a data maximalist approach, not a data minimalist approach, but a data collectivist approach whereby aggregate data is available for collectives to build new businesses. And our thinking is that data that is available out there, a base layer of data, should never be hoardable, and it should never be held as trade secrets by companies. And we need policies to ensure that data is available so that worker cooperatives can take this data, so that businesses and technologists can build a cooperative model that can work together with public data sets. So this, I think, is really important, because in the discourse, what is prioritized is a startup mentality, right? So an entrepreneurial zeal, where the individual technologist who is the innovator is always, leading the discursive and economic narrative. And here, there are subsidies, regulatory sandboxes, finances, incentives, everything for startups, but nothing for cooperatives. And this has to change. So we really need technologists and platforms to come together and work as cooperatives. And we need to get the terms of the policies and rights very, very clear. So what we propose is the following. The discourse of data rights needs to move. The first thing we need is, yes, we do need privacy, and the frames through which we design platform co-ops in the Indian context will certainly need to address privacy, because we are an immensely casteist, racist, sexist, and unequal society. And what we have seen repeatedly in the stories of delivery workers, drivers, etc., is that gig platforms have pandered to customers who have blatantly insulted workers from minority religious communities, etc. And when co-ops in India think data, ways to segment the data pool and create intelligence, has to really be in a manner in which we can look at data as a tool for emancipation, and we should make sure that the initiatives that we set up through cooperativism espouse data practices that completely set aside social stratification that creates a moral hazard in the market in the form of this kind of abuse of data, which undermines human rights. But this is something all of us know. So what is it that we need to know, and what is it about data rights that we need for platform cooperativism to flourish? We need to start thinking of the right to data value. And this is about the right of access in data, which is not the right of access that we talk about in terms of accessibility to connectivity. We need accessibility to data so that the value that is inherent in data pools that are held in enclosures captured by corporations have to be opened up. You cannot have an Amazon that collects the data, processes the data, creates a cloud infrastructure, provides you analytics service, and does all of this and builds alternative AI businesses getting into agriculture, right? So what is happening is this is a kind of a monopolistic practice which is creating a new structural barrier in the market which can never ever be broken, even if you encourage cooperatives through incentives just to collectivize. You need to actually break the patterns in the data economy and steer it in favor of alternative value systems by preventing data collectors from also operating in other layers of the digital economy. And here I want to put in a word of caution just before I end, which is that in the West, we often talk about data trusts. And this, I think, is something we have to really be extremely cautious about, because we do not want to create vehicles which facilitate an alternative to the mainstream platform economy that can simply be gobbled up by predatory companies. So you set up a data trust, you pool your data, and then you wait to monetize it so that somebody can buy up that data. So that would really be emulating the example I gave from China that follows the mainstream analytics, right? It's a self-defeating endeavor where the collective then becomes a convenient force to entrench a predatory mainstream market. So coming back to the role of policy, many things are happening in India. We have an imminent non-personal data policy, which is going to recommend, hopefully, that data has to be open. It has to really be public in that sense, not open in the sense of open washing, but it has to be public. So you can access, for instance, just imagine that if Uber data were anonymized and aggregated and made public, alternative businesses run by workers could actually use that data to set up. It's not rocket science to build a program which allows drivers, an ability to sequence their rides and connect with customers. It's not like it's such a technological marvel that you cannot emulate that kind of software platform. So we need to move in that direction. Of course, in India, we badly need the personal data protection law. Without that, I think we shouldn't move in the data market. So the non-personal data regulation and the personal data regulation have to move hand in hand. And we also need to think very clearly about how cooperatives can benefit from public services for analytics. So like the public cloud, digital infrastructure for platform cooperatives, which can perform certain functions. Otherwise, they have to go to IBM to do their analytics. We also need to ask the question of our government if the various data stacks that are building up, right, for education data, agriculture data, health data, whether, for instance, the ag stack, the agriculture data stack can be designed differently so that farmer-producer cooperatives can be given priority in accessing this data, right? So today, the priority is given to corporations, right? So the priority should actually be given to farmer cooperatives, producer cooperatives which want to use this data. So I think that what you need to tinker with to make the platform cooperativism movement indigenized and work for the Indian economy is to really be able to manage the data rights discourse and put in place institutional mechanisms through which value can be redistributed in the economy through a certain legislative as well as kind of institutionalized practices, which can build on existing ethos that is prevalent in these oases and small pockets where cooperativism has thrived. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anita. There is so much to digest here. I thought this was such an excellent presentation of framing this, where we can go with the digital economy in terms of collectivizing it, having a more common space approach with all these themes that are a part of it. Unfortunately, we are 2 minutes beyond time. And I really want to see like how we can have this discussion in a more ongoing manner, that we can continue this maybe on a more regular basis, because I think this is so important, and there isn't a forum so as much that I've seen that focuses on it's just about this aspect. And I just want to give a shout out to everyone here, Anita, Arun, Vibodh, and Sonia, for your excellent presentations and for taking the time to come here. Saloni Muralidhara from SEWA Gujarat was sick and wasn't able to make it, unfortunately. I just want to also point to the events that we have lined up in the coming week, because there are a couple more events that are more region specific, which is one that is happening tomorrow, which is an affiliated event that's focused on platform cooperativism development in Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. And then there is one that's happening on Wednesday that's focused on just the development of platform co-ops in Brazil. And alongside that, I'll just quickly share my screen and you can go to our website, take a look at that as well. But we have Exit to Community tomorrow, looking at how corporations can move to a cooperative model or employee ownership model, and exiting in that way. Then there's unions and cooperatives, DAOs and cooperatives, data cooperatives, there's a global cooperative commonwealth, and then finally we have a closing session. And we are very lucky to have Mackenzie Walk be a part of it as being the keynote for that. So thank you again, everyone. The questions that you have and the comments that you put in the chat, I'm going to put them together in a document and send it out. And maybe in a way that we can have this in a more ongoing manner. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm going to close this session here. I could continue for hours, honestly, with what has been brought about right now. Unfortunately. Bye, everyone. Thank you.